The presenter is Professor Marco Bartoli. Professor Marco is a biochemist and ecosystem ecologist broadly interested in aquatic ecosystems and how humans alter their diversity and function. He is focused on answering fundamental questions about energy flow and biogeochemical cycling of different elements across the land-coastal continuum. Professor Marco is Associate Professor in the Department of Chemistry, Life Science and Environmental Sustainability of the University of Parma, Italy since 2017, where he is responsible for the Lab of Aquatic Ecology and Benthic Function. Professor Marco is also the coordinator of the Open Lab we have in Italy, Open Lab number 6, and that is based in the Po River. And today he will introduce us the presentation, Water, What Atmosphere Fluxes of Greenhouse Gas in Wetlands, the Role of Aquatic Vegetation. So yes, Marco, thank you for joining us today, and you can start. I cannot hear you.
Exactly. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, and
yes.
You can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you very much for your introduction. Well, today I will try to convince you about the important role of aquatic vegetation as a regulator of greenhouse gas. In my presentation, I will have a quick overview about the way biogeochemists group aquatic plants, not in a systematic way, but according to the portion of the ecosystem they occupy. I will try to convince you that they play a very important, not negligible role in regulating greenhouse gas exchange from aquatic ecosystem to the atmosphere. I will also tell about the large heterogeneity that of fluxes, okay, suggesting some local regulation and some plant-specific regulation. I will then do a couple of steps backwards to describe the reasons for the relevance of aquatic vegetation as driver of the fluxes, and I will speak about oxygen availability in terrestrial and in aquatic ecosystems. I will speak about the specific adaptation of the most important factor that contribute to the role of the plants as conduit for greenhouse gas to the atmosphere, and then I will conclude with I will try to describe the perspective of this kind of studies in the context of climate change and eutrophication. Okay. Okay, so I said that biogeochemists like me are not expert in the systematics or in the phylogenetic relationship among plants, and we tend to group them according to the place they occupy in different ecosystems. So we have basically four main groups of plants, of aquatic plants: those that are emergent, that are submerged, the floating leaf plants, and the completely floating plants. Examples are here. The emergent plants, they have a minor portion of their body into the aquatic systems, the roots specifically, but most of the photosynthetic part is outside the water in the atmosphere. So they somehow directly connect the sediment with the atmospheric compartments, and they can provide conduit for gas exchange. The submerged plants, on the contrary, are completely living submerged in the aquatic ecosystems. Most of them have roots anchor them, the plants, to the sediments, and they exert an important oxidizing action because they produce oxygen not in the atmosphere but directly in the aquatic ecosystem, which affects greenhouse gas production and transfer. And they have a really important role that we'll describe later about the oxygenation of the sediment. Okay, the floating plant leaves, the floating leaf plants, are plants that are similar to the first category. They are not emerging, but they have the leaves that are floating on the water surface. As such, they do photosynthesis outside the water mass. They take up CO2 from the atmosphere. They also connect with their big roots, the sediment compartment with the atmosphere, okay? But they have another role. They shade the water column. They prevent light penetration, and they prevent the action, for example, of winds in the reaeration and reoxygenation of the water bodies. The last category is the category of floating plants. Those plants, we see some examples here, have the leaves outside the water and the roots floating in the water. So they take up nutrients directly from the aquatic ecosystems, and they typically create homogeneous monospecific meadows of plants, okay, which are entirely occupying the water surface. As such, they tend to isolate the water masses from the atmosphere, and typically they're associated to very eutrophic, nutrient-rich ecosystem, degraded aquatic ecosystem, in which the water mass is generally anoxic. And this is the reason for large potential methane production. What I describe here can be summarized in a nice picture, in a nice drawing taken from a paper by Bodmer et al. It's a review that addressed specifically the role of these hybrid plants occupying simultaneously the sediment, the water column, the water surface, and growing also outside the water on the methane cycle. But the same approach described in this paper can be applied to all the other greenhouse gas, including CO2 and N2O. How plants modify the chemistry and the dynamics of a shallow water ecosystem, basically by increasing the amount of carbon in the system, by fixing it, by the sedimentation of the dead organic material, by creating a barrier for the transport of suspended material that can be retained and accumulated within the canopies of the plants, by connecting, okay, as I described earlier, the deep sediment with the atmosphere, or by providing some barriers for gas exchange. So there are, as you see, many numbers and a lot of plant-specific way that plants can modify locally some of the different dynamics resulting in the net flux of a gas from the sediment to the atmosphere. And we have now a list of a few examples of studies in which the role of plants was analyzed. Okay, we start from a paper from Bolpani and collaborators from 2007, targeting a floating plant, the Trapanatans, and demonstrating on a daily study during the peak of the biomass of Trapa that this plant during the light period is able to reverse the fluxes of CO2 that are generally occurring in the water surface devoid of plants, but simultaneously, this is something positive that a service provided by the plant, but simultaneously in the light period, the plant favor the release of large methane fluxes to the atmosphere. So there is a contrasting effect that the plant produces on these two greenhouse gas. And the same was demonstrated in another study by Ribaudo et al. In 2012, focusing on this floating leaf plant, Nuphar lutea, which is having a big roots, as you can see from the picture, very anchored into the sediment and a lot of floating leaves. And in this annual study, which was integrating all the fluxes measured during the vegetative period, Ribaudo demonstrated that similarly to Trapanatans, the canopy of Nuphar lutea is a trap, is a net seasonal trap for CO2, reversing again the fluxes that are measuring in the same place in the absence of the plant, but it's increasing and doubling the emission of methane. And again, something similar was demonstrated in a very nice studies carried out from Rabey and Kotner in 2022, carried out over a large number of ponds, 26 in total, all characterized by the dominance or the presence of duckweeds, which are belonging to the four categories, these floating plants with the roots in the water. And again, as they have the leaves at the interface between the sediment and the water and the atmosphere, they take up CO2 by growing, and they reverse the natural source of the water column, and they act as a sink for CO2. But as demonstrated for Trapa and for Nuphar lutea, they increase the emission, the diffusive and ablative fluxes of methane to the atmosphere. Okay. Another nice study is to convince us about the relevance of including vegetation in any budget study in which we want to consider the overall emission from any aquatic shallow wetland ecosystem. Okay, is this one in which the role of two macrophytes, T. palatifolia, which is an emerging plant, and Brasenia strawberry, which is a floating leaf plant, these two plants occupy in this small wetland a minor fraction of the total surface, nearly 26%. But they modify deeply the chemistry of the water where they are present by increasing the concentration of both methane and CO2. And through the exchange they mediate, they regulate up to 82% of the total carbon fluxes in the whole system. So small surface occupied by the vegetation, but disproportionate effects on the overall exchange, suggesting that the plants should always be included, even if they occupy a minor fraction of the total wetland surface. Okay, that's another nice study carried out on Phragmites australis, which is one of the most widespread and abundant aquatic plant or emergent macrophyte. This is a paper that is from 2001. It's a relatively old paper, but very, very interesting because for the first time, to my knowledge, this author were not only simultaneously considering the CO2 trap by the plants and the methane emission by the plants, but they were analyzing comparatively, okay, the net global warming effect that the wetland produce by being simultaneously a CO2 trap and a methane source. And what authors conclude is that over the short term, a few decades, up to 60 years, most of the wetlands releasing methane because of the high greenhouse effect of methane as compared to that of CO2 can be considered as a source of greenhouse gases. But on a longer time perspective, because of the decay of the methane in the atmosphere, most of the wetland can be considered a net greenhouse gas sinks. Okay. There is another gas. I was speaking mostly about CO2 and methane, but the N2O is another very important potentially greenhouse gas for this effect, which is even higher of that of methane. And there is a single recent study that was focusing on the regulation that different aquatic vegetation exerts on the flux of N2O. And surprisingly, this author didn't demonstrate any significant effect of vegetation. Rather, they concluded that only the concentration of nitrate in the water column, which is the level of eutrophication, is the regulator of the net fluxes from the water to the atmosphere of N2O. Okay, I think that more studies should be devoted to this gas because there are parallel studies that analyze the way that roots in many aquatic plants exert on nitrogen cycles, stimulating nitrification, for example, as well as denitrification, and both microbial processes produce N2O. So more studies should be devoted to this gas. I was saying in my outline that there is large heterogeneity. In this work by Lambrook of 2010, we can see how in the same areas, different aquatic plants can be responsible for very variable, extremely variable emission of methane. But the author suggests that this variability is not directly due to the plants, but is due to the microbial communities that are growing in the rhizosphere of these plants, and specifically on the bacteria that can reoxidize methane and that can live in strict proximity of the roots. Okay, as described in this scheme, I will not go into the detail, but it's just showing the coupled oxidations that are mediated by the oxygen transported by the plants to a lot of end products of anaerobic respiration in the sediment. And one of these oxidation involves the oxidation of methane back to CO2, which can prevent the degassing of methane to the atmosphere. And it's evident that these plants have different interaction with such microbial communities. Okay. Also, another nice review analyzing many papers about the net effect of plants on greenhouse gas. Well, the results of this review are contrasting. some of the study highlights that the plants can really reduce, okay, the fluxes of gas. Others say that there is no net effect, and others say that they increase the emission. Okay, this result suggests that we have to study more, to go more into detail, to homogenize the methods to study these issues, because they are important issues, okay, and we have to increase the amount of data available, okay. And likely, they also suggest that there is a large heterogeneity in the situation, which depend on site-specific features, among which the most important is the trophic level, the state of conservation of the wetlands that is considered, okay. The same authors that did this review analyzed with molecular techniques, this is something novel in traditional biogeochemical studies, the bacteria that are associated to the roots of floating plants, these plants that are induce production of methane because they make most of the aquatic ecosystem anoxic. And they reveal that is very interesting, that these plants stimulate the production of methane, but simultaneously stimulate the reoxidation of the methane produced, because they live together with a lot of bacteria that are capable of oxidizing the methane, reducing the net emission to the atmosphere. Okay, and now, after all these examples in which I think that the effect is clear, okay, in one or the other direction, I go back to the reasons for this regulation that plants operate. And I have to speak about oxygen. And the message here is to understand that when we compare life in terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem, we have to consider that in any terrestrial ecosystem, the availability of oxygen is huge. Okay, we live and we think it's normal to respire an air that contains 21% of oxygen, but the Earth is the only planet with such a huge availability. And when we compare the availability of oxygen in the atmosphere with the availability of oxygen in the water, we discover that there is a huge difference. This is an old paper from 1954 describing the solubility of oxygen in any aquatic ecosystem, and describing in particular the relationship between the solubility and the temperature of the water. This is something known, okay, but when we compare in 1 liter of water how much oxygen is available as compared to 1 liter of air, we discover that, for example, at 20 degrees, we have in the water nearly 9 milligrams per liter, which is more than 30 times less than the equivalent amount of oxygen in the air, which is more than 300 milligrams per liter. And this amount of oxygen is decreasing along with increasing temperature. So when the plants have the peak of their biomass, or when they start their decay, in temperate areas like Italy, for example, the water column can get up to 30 degrees or 32 degrees, and there is very little oxygen available for the plants and for the microbial communities for their respiration. Okay, and we have some clearly understanding of the low solubility of oxygen and also of other gas when we look to aquatic ecosystems filled with vegetation in summer and at midday. Okay, we always see bubbles associated to vegetation, including algae, macroalgae, aquatic plants, and all these bubbles are pure oxygen that cannot be retained in aquatic ecosystem. The aquatic ecosystems are unlucky as compared to terrestrial ecosystem, in which the availability of oxygen is the same all over the year, in the day and in the night. But in aquatic ecosystem, this is not the same. The biomass, which is the carbon fixed by the plants, remains in situ. But this dynamics of the carbon is uncoupled from the dynamics of oxygen, that in most of the situation escapes from the systems and goes to the atmosphere. And that's a big limitation for plants. Even more when we consider, or when we analyze the sediments, because when the microelectrodes were introduced in microbial ecology, there was a big surprise analyzing the distribution of oxygen and the vertical availability of oxygen in the sediment. And in most of the wetlands, in most of organic sediment, the penetration of oxygen is limited to the upper 1 or 2 millimeters, which means that in wetlands having 10 meters of peat, 10 meters of organic carbon, the proportion of the anaerobic metabolism to the total is irrelevant. So most of the sediments in which the plants have to put their roots and have to grow are anoxic. And this is something that we have to remember, because makes a huge difference with terrestrial plants that live in soil which are always saturated with air and having a lot of oxygen available. And so aquatic plants, and this is a fundamental reason to understand, okay, why they are transferring a lot of greenhouse gases from the sediment to the atmosphere, they have developed specific adaptation, which is an airy tissue. An airy tissue that it's called aerenchyma, that connects the tips of the leaves with the tips of the roots. And it's a system of canals, okay, providing very low resistance to gas exchange, by which part of the oxygen production during photosynthesis can be driven not to the water column or not to the atmosphere, but to the roots, allowing the survival of the plants and the respiration of the cells in the roots, okay. And this is the key point, because most of the roots in aquatic plants have permeable walls through which oxygen can diffuse. So not only the plant provides the roots with oxygen, but indirectly, okay, the oxygen which is transferred to the roots can escape from the roots and diffuse outwards, creating microbial layers, okay, of sediments that are oxic, in which aerobic metabolism can be carried out, okay. And if we think about the huge amount of roots that every plant has, okay, we speak about kilometers of tiny roots in macrophyte meadows, in which there is a small layer, even submillimetric layer, but very important volume of oxic sediments, in which coupled reoxidation can be carried out, including methane oxidation. And this is more or less what happens in any submerged aquatic vegetation. During the day, there is large photosynthesis pushing oxygen downwards and favoring a lot of microbial processes, including kind of biogeochemical ecosystem services, which is methane oxidation, preventing the accumulation of methane in sediment. And the same is true in the night, because the canals are still open and there is diffusion from the water column to the leaves and then to the roots. And the same is true for emergent plants, okay, which connects directly the atmosphere to the sediment. But this connection is not one way. It's not the only way is from the leaves to the roots. It's also from the sediment to the atmosphere or to the water column, because most of the gas moves according to concentration gradients. There are techniques now that are really fascinating, because they allow to see these dynamics. Planar optodes are incredible systems by which, through a modified aquarium, one can monitor, okay, during the day and during the night, the dynamics of the oxygen in the rhizosphere. This is a very short movie, 30 seconds, showing 2 days of measurements and 6 months of elaboration of these images, in which a fluorescent treated material, okay, covering the inner wall of an aquarium, is in contact with the rhizosphere of Vallisneria spiralis, one of the plants that we are studying more, and showing clearly that within a background of anoxic sediment, there is a pump pushing oxygen during the day and consuming oxygen during the night. And including the topic of biodiversity, this service of oxidation is enjoyed by other organisms that live in the rhizosphere, taking advantage of the favorable chemical conditions, worms, for example, and with simple experiments combining the presence or the absence of vegetation and the presence or the absence of macrofauna like worms, we were able to demonstrate that submerged vegetation can reduce methane emission via ebullition, which is the main pathways by which methane is transferred from the sediment to the atmosphere, by up to 95%. This can be converted into money. It's a quantitative demonstration of the importance of plants and of the importance of biodiversity in reducing greenhouse gas emission by just leaving aquatic vegetation, specifically submerged plant, in an ecosystem. I'm going to conclude my presentation just describing our perspective and what future study should target. okay? Because we live in a period of big changes, including interacting pressures on aquatic ecosystems like eutrophication, which is the enrichment of nutrients in any aquatic ecosystem. It's something that Europe is used to, but it's something which is growing in many other developing countries. And we are undergoing an impressive increase in the water temperature. And the interaction between eutrophication, also biological invasion, new species that are appearing in more vulnerable systems, okay, and climate change are favoring, this is what the literature is saying, a shift in the dominance of these four groups of vegetation. So in pristine ecosystem, the dominance was by rooted plants, submerged plants growing in the bottom of the system because of transparency, low nutrient level, high light penetration. But along with the warming of the water and the increase of the nutrients, the roots are not necessary anymore to extract nutrients from the system because the plants can find the nutrients to grow directly in the water column. So it's expected, and it's already occurring in many aquatic wetlands, that the future dominant stable state of plants will be of the floating one. And these floating plants can prevent gas exchange, are not oxidizing the sediment, are favoring the production of methane and the accumulation of methane in the water column. And there is a very nice study, and this is my last slide, from Avian and Toll in 2022. They were combining two factors. They were simulating an increase in the water temperature, and they were simulating a shift in the dominance of plants from submerged dominated system to floatingly dominated system, and they were analyzing comparatively, okay, along this gradient of temperature, the net production of methane, okay, and of greenhouse gas in general. And they demonstrated that systems dominated by floatingly vegetation, they produce much more methane, okay, and they degas much more methane as compared to pristine system characterized by submerged vegetation. So the take-home message is that the plants are important. Plants regulate the dynamics of greenhouse gas. This regulation is mainly due to the necessity of plants to have oxygen, especially in the sediment, to allow root respiration. And submerged plants are the good ones, the ones that at the very beginning of the problem, the sediment, which is anoxic, can attenuate the emission of methane or the retention of CO2 in their mass, okay? But we have ongoing changes, and future management action should be targeting the control of invasion by this opportunistic vegetation and the restoration in a way to improve the abundance of submerged vegetation. And with this, I'm finished, and I thank you for your attention.